thanks for coming. It's great to see so many people here. I think having people in an in-person event's really good. So I'm going to talk about blockchains. The person who really got me interested in this was my ex-PhD student, Jonathan Budd, and he was working on his PhD sort of the period between 2010 and 2013. And his wife got a job in London. So he went off to London and finished his PhD off remotely, working part-time. But one day I got an email from him and he said, have you ever heard of this stuff called Bitcoin? Because I think you'd be really interested. And I hadn't. And at the same time, I had this guy, Tony Kozinski from South Africa, used to come and visit me every year and we used to work on stuff. And one of the main reasons he liked to come was because he liked visiting Melbourne, but we always did some work. And we'd run out of stuff to do because we'd finished our previous project. So we started looking at blockchain and we got very interested in it. And now I've been interested in it ever since. I should emphasize my interest is in the engineering of blockchain. Bitcoin is an object of speculation. I mean, I keep my eye on the papers and stuff, but I don't claim any particular expertise on that. And so that's a different matter. But I'm just going to talk about the engineering because I think there's some really, really fascinating things. So I have to work out how to make this work. So I want us to talk about money. I want us to think about money. So I've got $5 here, one of the old ones, got the Queen on. Vera, here's $5.
Thank you.
So should Vera be happy that she's got $5?
Yes.
Yes, and why? She's got a piece of plastic. What use is that piece of plastic? Why is it good that she's got a piece of plastic? Okay, exchange it for goods and services, probably, something she might want. So why is Vera confident she can do that?
There is something that supports that node. The money is a node. There is some support that could be gold or something like that in the bank.
So you're basically saying it's guaranteed by the central bank. And that's what an economist would say. And I think to some extent it's true. I mean, occasionally along the way, I was in Argentina when their currency was no use, and I was in Zimbabwe when their currency was no use. So there's certainly some places where the central bank's not strong enough. And so therefore there is a problem with the currency. But I don't think that every time we go and spend a note, which I personally don't do very much now, that we think, oh, this is supported by the central bank. So when Vera's going to go and spend that $5, she's not going to think, oh, this is value because the central bank says so. I think she is going to do it because she knows it works. We've all done it many times. We have confidence in it. And in fact, I think it's about trust. Okay, we've learnt to trust the money. And the basis of that trust might be what you said, Armin, that it's the central bank. But I don't think that we think that when we spend money. I think we just do it because it works, because we're used to it. And if anyone wants to talk about that, happy to talk about it later. But that's what I think about money. It's about trust. And just to illustrate that point, I've got a picture here of a British, I think it's British pound, but British £10, right? And what it actually says on British currency, it says, I promise to pay the bearer of this note the sum of £10. And it's under the signature of the Bank of England. So what the British currency legally is a promissory note. You can take that to the Bank of England and they'll give you £10. I'm not sure what they're actually going to give you. Which makes you realize that money's an abstract quantity, right? That's just a significant signifier of value, as is that piece of plastic. So money's about trust. So let's just bear that in mind as I go on. So one thing about trust is cash transactions do not require the payer or payee to trust each other, right? Vera, as it happens, I do know Vera. She knows me and I hope she trusts me, but what if she didn't, right? What if we hadn't met? She didn't know me, She might know me and decide I'm not trustworthy. She'd still believe that $5 that she can go and use it. So they don't require payer and payee to trust or even know each other. And they're difficult to regulate and to tax, which is why there's a cash economy, right? Governments can't keep track of what's going on. And if you're a criminal, you want to be paid in use readies, well, you know, they're hard to track. That's fine, but there aren't that many transactions these days where people actually are in person to exchange a piece of plastic or a piece of paper. Quite a lot of our commerce these days is online. And if you think about standard electronic transactions, they require what a trusted authority. Could be the credit card company, it could be a bank, it could be PayPal, it could be something like that. They're supposed to verify that, well, they have to do the task of verifying the payer's got sufficient funding to be able to make the transaction, and verifying that the payee, or to adjust the account balances of the payer and payee, right? That's what, you know, your credit card company does, or PayPal, or something like that. And these trusted authorities typically charge a commission, and the record of transactions there, so that makes them easy to tax, and it makes them easy to regulate. So at the moment, standard electronic transactions are not like cash. So now a bit of history. Back in 2009, a paper appeared on, it was a white paper that appeared on the web. In fact, there was different versions. I think one of them might have been late 2008. First there was a white paper, and then there was some code. The author of the paper is Satoshi Nakamoto, and they proposed the concept of Bitcoin, and they put it forward as an electronic equivalent of cash. So they were saying it was a way of doing electronic commerce that worked like cash, so it didn't require a trusted third party to adjust balances. So how does it work? By the way, Satoshi Nakamoto is not a real person, and anyone who pays attention to these things, every now and again, there is an industry trying to work out who he, she, they are, is. And every now and again, someone gets put forward as the real Satoshi Nakamoto, but no one has actually publicly been acknowledged as such to this date. So how does it work? Accounts in Bitcoin are called Bitcoin wallets, and the balances of all accounts are public, which makes it different from our own bank accounts. Our own bank accounts, the balance is not public, but in Bitcoin, the balance of every wallet is public, but what's not known is who owns them. So the security is actually at the level of who owns the accounts, not the actual balances. Balances, anyone could go and look at them. And the important thing that you need to make a payment system work is a way of doing transactions. And what's a transaction? A transaction is just a debit of one account and a credit of one or more other accounts. That's all. So transactions that alter the balance of Bitcoin wallets, they're recorded and they're verified in a coded form in something which is called the blockchain. So that's what the blockchain is. It's just a list of transactions, credits and debits of accounts. That's all. And this blockchain's maintained by a community of participants. And as we see in the next couple of slides, they're called miners. And why is this blockchain secure? What's to stop any of us just creating our own ledger of debits and credits of Bitcoin wallets? The thing that makes it secure is that it's hard to create. And in fact, it's computationally extremely hard to create. And that's what makes it secure. And I'll explain in detail how that works. So it's a distributed ledger. Blocks are added to it, and the word we use is mining, because there's a sort of analogy with actual real mining of gold. And the times at which these blocks are added actually form a random point process. Very, very well modeled by a Poisson process. We actually have a paper on why it's not exactly a Poisson process, but that's really, you know, at a real margin. Poisson process is a very good model for it. And once it's been mined, the block is added to the blockchain, and the community of miners starts working on adding the next block, right? So they're all constantly trying to add a block. They add one, and then they start working on adding a new one. And to talk about how this happens, there's a whole bunch of different computer science and mathematical concepts. And one of them that makes this work, and I'm not going to mention all of them, but one I am going to mention is the hash function. It's a CSH256 hash that's applied twice, if you really want the details. But you can think of it as a hash function H that maps the non-negative integers, and therefore any string of characters or whatever, because you can always code that up, to the non-negative, to the numbers between 0 and 2 to the 256 minus 1. So it maps everything to a 256-bit length sequence of zeros and ones. And by the way it works, it's reasonable to assume that the hash values are uniformly distributed over that whole range. And just for the sake of comparison, there's almost as many numbers between 0 and 2 to the 256 and minus 1 as there are atoms in the universe. So there's plenty of numbers to play with. And the relevant property of the hash function is that if it's easy to calculate h of z for any z, but for practical purposes, it's impossible to construct z from h of z. So you cannot invert that function. So you can't take the output and get the input. It's really easy to take the input and get the output, but reversing that calculation is practically impossible. So this is how it works. There's the blockchain, and at the head of the blockchain, there's this previous hash. So it's the hash that's sitting there. There's all these transactions, you know, debits and credits of various accounts coming in. And the miners have all got a list of these, a pool of these. And they take all these and they verify it. So they're supposed to look back in the previous blockchain and check that the debit accounts have got enough money, and then they alter the balances and they're all fine, right? So they check them all, and they code them all up by taking a hash function of the tree that makes these things. It's called a Merkle tree. I don't fully understand what a Merkle tree is, so I guess some of the computer scientists here would. So there's a hash from the previous blockchain. There's a hash that sort of encapsulates all the information in these transactions. And there's a third hash, which is called a nonce, which is just a random number. And what miners do is they take that, they take this, they take that, and they hash the whole lot. And they get a new hash. So it's just about applying hash functions to different things. So what's special about this? What's special is this new hash has to satisfy a certain criterion to be acceptable. And it's a really difficult criterion to satisfy. So most likely, it's not going to be acceptable. And if it's not acceptable, what miners do is they try a new random number for the nonce, and they do it again. And most likely, it's not going to be acceptable again. So they try a new value of the nonce, and they keep doing this, right? And at some stage, they might be lucky. They have to be incredibly lucky, and I'll tell you exactly how lucky in a minute. They might get one that is acceptable. And when it is, great. They've said to have mined a block. All these transactions become an official part of the ledger, and they have to tell everyone else this is what they've done. So what makes the block acceptable? It's when the new hash is less than a specified threshold, L. And I say the only practical way to do the number is to keep trying different nonces. L at the moment is, well, we'll go through this and then you'll see what L is. So what mining is a sequence of coin tosses, a sequence of Bernoulli trials. Each time you try a different nonce and get a new hash, It's like tossing a coin. And then you say, is it acceptable? Is it less than L? If it is, yes, great. If it's not, failure. Try again. So it's a sequence of Bernoulli trials. And the probability of any given candidate block being valid is L over 256, which at the moment is about 10 to the minus 21. It's the smallest legitimate number I have ever seen in 35 years of working on probability. You know, I thought it was sort of small when the probability of an error in a packet in asynchronous transfer mode networks was 10 to the minus 9. Or the probability of a single ticket winning Division 1 prize at Oz Lotto is 3.6 times 10 to the minus 8. Right? They're very, very small numbers. This is 10 to the minus 21. Seriously small number. So it's tossing a coin with a very, very low probability of success. You ask the question, how many times tosses you have to make on average before you get a success? Well, this is second year. I'll be teaching it in a couple of weeks. This is second year probability. The expected number of trials you need to get your first success is a geometric random variable. And the expected number is 256 over L. So that's about 10 to the 21. So why does it work? Computers are tossing these coins at a rate of 10 to the 18th per second. On average, they get a success every 10 minutes. So really, the sequence of mining incidents is a Poisson process with rate average 1 every 10 minutes. And a lot of people criticize Bitcoin for its power usage. It's precisely because of this. They've got these computers that are doing these coin tosses, essentially useless work, and they're using up electricity and generating heat, need to be air conditioned, all the rest of this stuff, just to keep doing this. Most of these are in server farm, CPU farms in northern China, where electricity is cheap and it's cold, so they don't actually have to spend so much on air conditioning. So that's how it works. Now, I'm going to stop. Has anyone got any questions about the mechanism for building the blockchain? Yeah?
The thing I've always wondered, like out of all of the participants competing for getting the right coin toss, it's only one is going to win every 10 minutes.
Yes.
And then everybody else loses. But then if you're a small player, then it's, well, it's going to take a long time before you get to any expected.
That's true. Everyone else loses, but you haven't invested anything, right? You can start working on the new hash. That's the new, you know, all you do is you replace the one that's just been, the new hash that's just been successful now becomes the previous hash. So all you have to do is change that in your calculation. So it's not like you've done all this work that's gone to waste. You've done a lot of work that hasn't achieved anything, but you've still got the same probability going forward of being successful. So there's no incentive. You know, once someone's mined a block and told you about it, you just change this value in your hash calculation and keep on going.
Yeah, but it's like a gambler's fallacy, kind of like Bitcoin. No, okay. I think I get it.
So that's what happened. And I'm going to say a little bit about that. Small miners quite often amalgamate themselves into pools. And it doesn't do anything for your expected gain, but what it does do is control the variability. Because you're quite right, as a small miner, there's a high variability. You might get nothing for a very long time.
Yeah.
And then if you do get something, you're going to get a lot. So what you tend to do is club together with other people and agree to share.
Yeah.
Okay, so now what is the problem having a blockchain's trying to solve? What is the problem? Remember I said that a trusted third party has to assure that everyone's got enough money, or the payers have got enough money, debit their account and credit the payee's account. And the reason I have to do that is to prevent double spending. It's a problem if I've got some money in my account and I go and buy something, and I use that money to buy something else. And the way that gets stopped in an ordinary system is my account gets debited, so I can't use the money again. But what's to stop me in Bitcoin? Agreeing with Kate, she's given me some goods, and I've given her, we put a transaction in, and I've debited my account. And then what's to stop me agreeing with Vera that I'm going to do the same thing with the same money, right? These things haven't been accepted straight away. So there's a problem, a potential danger of double spending. And the whole way the blockchain is designed is to guard against that. It's to make the problem of double spending go away. Because that's what you're actually trying to do with your financial system, stop people using the same money twice. So how do you do that? Well, there's actually a little model in Nakamoto's paper. I think it's great. First time I read this paper, I thought, there's a little probability model in the paper. It's section 9 or 10, so it's not at the beginning, but it is in there. And they don't just say that it's impossible for an attacker to defraud the system and do a double spending. It's called a double spending attack. But they do say it's incredibly unlikely, and they actually have an expression for how unlikely it is. So how might you do this? Well, I do my transaction with Kate. We put our transaction in. We send it off to the miners. They're all busy incorporating it into the next block. And sooner or later, it'll get incorporated in a block and it'll be there. Meanwhile, I send my transaction to Vera and I furiously start working on my own blockchain because I'm a miner as well. And I'm hoping to beat the community in the race. So as soon as, if my second transaction gets to be the long-term incorporated one, I get whatever I get from Vera and she gets paid. Unfortunately, Kate's already given me the goods and her transaction's disappeared, so she doesn't get paid. That's the problem. So what Nakamoto is interested in is, if the community is working at some rate lambda 2, and you're a malicious player who can work at rate lambda 1, lambda 1's not as big as lambda 2, the whole thing is predicated on the fact no one's as big as, there's no player big enough to dominate the whole community. So what Nakamoto wanted to show is that it's really a small probability that an attacker who couldn't actually generate blocks as fast as the community could actually build a blockchain longer than the community and therefore do all sorts of nasty things with double spending. So just to be clear, I've just accepted payment in Bitcoin for some goods. Nakamoto recommended you should wait until your transaction's been included in a block. So Kate shouldn't give me the goods until she's seen the transaction in a block. And what's more, she should probably wait a little bit longer just to make sure that block's got sufficiently deep in the chain that she can trust it. And Nakamoto said Z further blocks have been added on top of the one that's got our transaction in. And Nakamoto said Z should be 6, which corresponds to waiting an hour. So if Kate's, sending me some electronic equipment from the other side of the world, it's probably not going to hurt if she waits for an hour before she dispatches it. If she's selling me a coffee in a coffee shop in Fitzroy, I'm probably going to be a bit annoyed if I have to wait an hour, but that's not going to be a big transaction. So what Nakamoto said, you wait a bit, right? Just to see the transaction get deep enough in the chain, because as that happens, transactions get deeper and deeper in the blockchain, you can trust them more and more. So here's the formula that Nakamoto came up with in his paper. Lambda 1's the rate the malicious player can mine. Lambda 2's the rate that the whole community mines. Nu is this thing that's lambda 1 over lambda 2, and Z is the number of blocks Kate waits before she sends the goods off to me. So all the parameters are in here. It's a complicated formula, got a sum, but it's not a hard thing to evaluate. And this is really small, right? For any reasonable values of lambda 1, lambda 2, and Z. So this shows that I can't do that because my transaction with Kate is going to be the one that survives, and unfortunately, Vera, yours is the one that's not going to survive, right? Okay. So how did Nakamoto get this? Well, there's two observations. If the dishonest miner can create blocks at rate lambda 1 and the community, and at rate, of course, when I say that, I work in probability, it means that these things get created as a Poisson process at rate lambda 1 or a Poisson process at rate lambda 2. It doesn't mean that it's a deterministic rate. That's something that sort of deterministic applied mathematicians have difficulty with, but when a probabilist says it, we mean it's the rate of a Poisson process. You can actually write down an expression for the probability the dishonest miner can catch up. So if lambda 2 is bigger than lambda 1, the dishonest miners, sorry, if lambda 1 is bigger than lambda 2, the dishonest miner will catch up with probability 1. The one with the higher rate will eventually catch up. But if lambda 1 is less than lambda 2 and you start L behind, you can actually write down an expression, and it turns out to be lambda 1 over lambda 2 to the L. So if lambda 1 is lambda 1 over lambda 2 is 0.1, then this, and L is 6, then it's 0.1 to the 6, so 10 to the minus 6. So that's fairly low probability. So, and how do you do that? Well, this is really, it's a gambler's ruin problem on a semi-infinite state space. You calculate the probability of the transient birth death space. So this is one where lambda 2 is bigger, so it's drifting upwards. But even though on average it's going to drift upwards, there's some probability it might come down because, as I say, things are random. And you can work out the hitting probabilities. This is something we would probably set in the third year Markov chain course as a problem to solve. It can verify by calculating the probability that the transient birth and death process is going to hit 0 if it starts at L. So that's right. That part of his calculation was good. I say his Nakamoto, Satoshi Nakamoto, as I say, is posed as a man, but I don't believe we know for sure. The second thing was, okay, how long is it going to take, well, what's the probability that the dishonest miner will be able to create k blocks in some time t? Well, it's a Poisson process, so there should be a Poisson distribution for the number of blocks. So this is, in fact, the Poisson probability mass function, and the parameter is this whole thing, lambda 1 z over lambda 2. Now, if this z over lambda 2 was a t, that would be the probability that the dishonest miner can mine k blocks in time t. And so what they've done is done that and put z over lambda 2, which is actually the expected time that it takes the community to mine z blocks. So that's the way that Satoshi Nakamoto came up with the calculation. So the number of blocks that attacker could create is a Poisson random variable with parameter lambda 1t, and then we put t equals z over lambda 2. But there's a problem with that. Z over lambda 2 is the expected time it would take the community to do that, but the actual time is random. So that calculation arises from actually substituting a random time with its expectation. Now, I do used to do it a lot more than maybe now, a lot of work in engineering. And replacing a random variable with its expectation is quite a common thing to do in engineering, and it's not a stupid thing to do, and often it's quite a good idea. But it is a stupid thing to do if the actual exact calculation is possible, which it is in this case. And this goes back again to some stuff that we do in our second year subject. You just think of the process of any blocks getting created, either by the community or by the attacker. And you call a created block a success if the community's done it, and a failure if the attacker's done it. So k is the random number of blocks created by the attacker in the time that it takes the community to create z blocks. And that makes z plus k the number of Bernoulli trials required to achieve z successes. And this is another distribution that, as I say, we discussed in our second year subject. It's a negative binomial random variable, and you can work out the parameters of it. So you take that, you go through the rest of it, and this is the proper expression that Nakamoto should have had in his paper. Now, the other one's small and this one's small. So the actual point that he's trying to make, that the probability of the attacker succeeding is small, is true, but he's got the wrong formula for it. And it was about 2014, I worked this out and thought, I'm going to be famous. I'll just write a paper and point out Nakamoto's wrong. Unfortunately, someone else already done it, a guy called Rosenfeld, and so I'm no longer famous. Anyway. Okay, so that's the second bit. I'm going to move on to something else. Anyone got any questions about that, the double spending attack?
Exceptions
is it just assumed that it's fairly much instantaneous? Or can you disrupt the information flow? You could somehow.
I'm going to talk about that in the second part.
Okay.
We did do some work on forking the blockchain, which is caused by communication delays. And the second part is going to be all about communication and mining. So it is true that when a block gets mined, the miner's supposed to tell the rest of the community that they've done it. And that takes some time. Now, when we were doing this work, the parameters are set that a block's mined on average every 10 minutes, so 600 seconds. When we were doing the work back in the 2013, 14, 15, the mean communication delay, it's a bit hard to tell because we don't know the actual structure of the graph, but we think it's about 10 to 12 seconds. These days, it seems to be a lot faster. We think the big miners have actually got high-speed links between them, but maybe not every miner. So there is a problem with communication, and even though the mean 600, there is a small probability that another block will get discovered while the communication's happening. And when that happens, it causes a block fork. And so you've got, some miners have got one version of the blockchain, another miner's got a different version. And the rules are you're supposed to mine on the longest version you know about. So that's why normally, if the communication was instantaneous, the new block would be longer and every miner would start mining on it. But if you've got the situation where there's two chains of equal length with different blocks at the end of it, then you've got what's called a block fork. It sort of resolves itself pretty quickly because people are mining on top of one, people are mining top on the other, maybe different groups. Sooner or later, one of them's going to build on it, and that's going to be the longest one. And it's extremely unlikely the other one will do it at the same time. So one of them wins, and whoever was on the losing side, bad luck, your transactions have to go into a new block, and that's just the long-term version. But the situation when that's a much more complicated thing going on is what I'm going to talk about in the second part of the talk. Okay, so one of the things about Bitcoin as a transaction processing system is it's not fast enough. And you can see that. The debit credit, the amount of information required to code that is about 600 bytes on average. In the software, the maximum size a Bitcoin block can have is 1 megabyte. So that means the maximum number of transactions a block can have is about 1,600. And as I said before, it's also said in the software they're mined on average every 10 minutes. So you do a little bit of maths on that. The best possible transaction processing rate that Bitcoin can do is 3 transactions per second. Visa can do 8,000, average. Peak 56,000. I actually gave a talk about this. It was at a applied probability conference in Edinburgh. And at the end of the talk, someone came up and said, my wife works for Visa and she tells me that they can do 80,000 a second. So that might even be an underestimate. Worldwide, Visa can actually deal with a really, really high number of transactions per second. Bitcoin can only do 3. PayPal apparently can do 200, so nowhere near the credit cards, but it can still do quite a lot. So Bitcoin is not competitive as a transaction processing system with any of these. So you might want it to be able to achieve higher processing. So how could you do this? Well, there's been various proposals in the Bitcoin, communication blogs, etc. But there's a couple of obvious things you can do. I mean, it's pretty arbitrary that a Bitcoin block has 1 megabyte. You can make them bigger. But if you do, they have more transactions in. And if they have more transactions in, it takes longer to verify them. So it's not just propagating to the rest of the community that you've found a block. They are supposed to check your calculations that all those transactions are legitimate. They're supposed to go back and look in the blockchain history and check that all the payers have got the right balance, etc.
You publish the nonce once you verify
Yes,
it?
yeah.
You publish it.
And does everyone have to verify, or is this?
Yeah, they're all supposed to verify it because it's the community that maintain it. Now, there are many, many versions of blockchains that doesn't happen. And in fact, I would characterize most, and I'm not a real expert in this, most of the new blockchains actually step back on that verification. They bring trust back in, right? This is really about things where you don't trust anyone. Okay? Or This 10 minutes is completely arbitrary. You could make that a microsecond if you want to. You just have to change that L. If they're doing these things at 10 to the minus 18, you could still make it quite difficult to get a success, but make the mean time to success a lot less than 10 minutes if you want to. So that makes mining faster. So the two things you could do, either make communication slower by increasing that, or mining faster by increasing that. Here we go, I just said all that. What both of these things do is increase the ratio of the mining rate to the communication rate. So it's the ratio that actually matters. And intuitively, this should increase the probability that someone mines something new while you're communicating the last one. So it should increase the probability that block forks occur. I'm glad you asked that question, because I should have explained it anyway. And what's more, if you have a fork, they may not actually be resolved straight away. But pretty much, by the way, back in the historical data we looked at, if you do the calculation 10 seconds over 600, you should have an average of about 2 forks a day, which is what happened. You can go and look at the data and see that happen. So that was sort of about right. But if you did either of these things, you would have more forks, and what's more, you could have more complicated forks. And therefore, the likelihood that everyone was in consensus about what the blockchain actually looked like would be a lot less likely. And in fact, the data structure is not going to be a blockchain. It's going to be something, I mean, we made this up. I'm not claiming that someone else wouldn't have made it up, but if you think of the data structure, it will actually be like a block tree, not a blockchain. You know, being a blockchain is sort of inherent that everyone's agreeing with it. So what we've done is use the Markov chain models, a couple of different ones, to study what would happen if we did either of these things. If we either increase the mean time for propagation or increase the mining rate. So let's imagine you've got capital N miners. And at time t, you've got, each miner's got its own version of the blockchain. And that's just some sequence of blocks. We're going to call this the local blockchain. And the number of blocks in it are the height. So if you're like some deity looking at the whole thing and can see all the miners all at once, the state of the system you could think of as just a set of everyone's local blockchain. They themselves don't know it, they only know about their local one, or they know about what someone else tells them. But let's imagine we're looking down on the system and see the whole lot. Now, one thing about this is everyone must agree about the beginning of their blockchains. And the reason for that is everyone agreed about the first block. It's called the Genesis block. And maybe there's some other blocks they all agree on, but there's always a sequence at the beginning where everyone agrees on. So for the purposes of accounting in the local blockchain, we're only going to worry about the final block of that. Everything, the first bit of it that everyone agrees on is essentially immaterial to this analysis. So we got this block tree. For one of these BTs, we can actually construct at least the final set of branches of the block tree. We don't construct the whole trunk where everyone agrees. I think of it as like one of those, if you've ever gone to the forest and seen mountain ashes, they're really tall eucalypts that are basically straight, and then they have a small lot of branches at the top. And that's what I think of this as being like. So what can happen? Well, the first one is if block n, if miner little n mines a block, it just appends that block to its own local blockchain. That's easy. But at the same time, these are all communicating. And what we do is we assume they're communicating, each of them can communicate at some rate omega, but they can only share that communication rate out amongst all the other miners. So the pairwise communication between any given two miners happens at rate omega over n minus 1. And so this models the event that if Bn is longer than Bm, Bn's telling everyone about its blockchain, it's forever sending it out. And if that communication happens to reach Bm and Bm says, oh, that's a better blockchain than one I've got, I'm going to throw mine away, I'm going to replace it with that and start mining on that. So this is communication. And the only other thing that can happen is if everyone agrees, apart from one minor which is shorter, and that minor gets told by one of the others, and there's n minus one of them all sending it at rate omega over n minus one. So at rate omega, or one of these others is going to tell this one, yeah, this is what we've got. And that takes you back to the state where everyone's in consensus. And then you throw away all the bits you agree on, and you only keep the last block. So that's return to consensus. And so the first result we've got is that the set of consensus states is positively current. Right? You will get in a consensus in finite expected time with probability 1. Might take you to the end of the universe, but this is a Markov chain result. It is positively current. And the way we prove it, you can do all the details, but essentially we observe that whatever state you're in, there is a sequence of transitions of the Markov chain that will get you to consensus, and that sequence doesn't depend on the current state. And the way it does is one of the minors with the longest local block chain minds a block, so it becomes the absolute longest, and then manages to tell all the other minors about that before anything else happens. Now that might be a low probability event, but it is a positive probability event, and if it does happen, doesn't matter what state the chain's in, it's going to get us into consensus. So that will tell us that it's positively current. So that's fine. We know that consensus is positively current. We know it's going to happen, finite expected time. As I said, it could be the end of the universe. So in a practical point of view, maybe it won't work. So what else can we do? Well, let's recalibrate the state space. We're not interested in the actual details of the tree, but what I am interested in is how many minors are at each height. So what I'm going to do is for any I greater than 1, let theta I of t be the proportion of minors whose local blockchain is at height I. I've got length there, length and height. It all depends whether you're thinking horizontally or vertically. So the number of minors whose local blockchain's got length I is n theta I. So at any time t, we've got some vector of lengths, and we can think of that as a random vector. Because these are all proportions, the sum of all these components is 1. So you can actually think of it as like a random probability mass function. So it's the random probability mass function of local blockchain lengths at time t, empirical. What happens to this? Well, if a minor of local blockchain has got a local chain of length I mines something, its local chain will go to length I plus 1, which will increase the proportion at I plus 1 by 1 over n, and decrease the proportion at I by 1 over n. So you'll get that type of transition. Or the other thing that happens is communication. A local chain of length I communicates to a shorter chain of length j. The one of length j abandons its chain, so that reduces the number at length j. Start using the one at length I, so that increases that. So there's just the two things that are going to happen. And we don't worry about return to consensus here. I'm thinking this is an infinite vector. Now, these are the rates these things happen. This is lambda times the number of minors of length I. And this is omega times the number of minors of length I multiplied by the number of minors of length j, but we've got an n minus 1 on the bottom line. So this, in fact, is order n, and so is that. Transactions make a difference of size 1 over n. So this is the definition of a density-dependent Markov chain. So what we do is we let n approach infinity. There's some quite deep, very analytical stochastic process results down to Tom Kurtz, and in fact, that's for finitely many compartments. The result for infinitely many compartments is down to Andrew Barber and Malvina Lushak. Andrew's an associate at Monash, and I believe at Melbourne. Malvina also is on a staff at Melbourne. So what it says is there's a sequence of Markov chains. As n approaches infinity, it satisfies a functional law of large numbers, which tells us that the dynamics are going to satisfy a system of differential equations. These thetas are infinitely length vectors, and it's probably easier to see what happens if you write the components of that infinite system. So this is the proportion have length 1. It's in terms of itself. That's actually a solvable equation. This is the proportion who have length I. They decrease when one of these ones at length I either gets mined or gets communicated from a longer chain. And it increases if one of the chains shorter joins it because you told it how good your chain is, or one of the chains at length I minus 1 mines something. Okay, not too much longer to go now. It's actually easier, it's more instructive if we, instead of looking at theta, which is sort of like the probability mass function at state I, we look at the cumulative distribution function, the sum of all the thetas up to j. So I'm going to redefine that in terms of a different variable phi. They satisfy similar equations. These are a very, very neat system of equations. We're really proud of these. An infinite system of equations. And I can say a few things about that, but I'll go on and say, first thing is you should always look at special cases. What about if there's no communication, which takes out the omega terms? Then you've got some quite simple equations, which again, anyone who's done our third year unit will have seen these. They're actually the Kolmogorov forward differential equations for a Poisson process. We know what the solution is. The number, as I said before, the number of events of a Poisson process up to time t has a Poisson distribution with parameter lambda t, and that's what that says. And the really interesting thing about that is a function of t, it's traveling at speed lambda, because we've got a lambda times t. And we know what the variance of the Poisson random variable is, it's lambda t, which makes the standard deviation the square root of lambda t. So what's happening here is this thing is traveling along to higher heights at rate lambda t, so the speed is lambda, but it's also spreading out because the variance, the standard deviation depends on t. So that's if omega is 0. But we think for positive omega, positive mining rate, positive communication, no matter how small, that does not happen. The wave does not spread out. We think it's got a limiting traveling wave solution. And if that's true, that would mean that it really is, like I said before, the bit where the branches are at the top of the tree is a bounded height. So it travels along. There is some bit at the end where there's no consensus, which a bounded distance from the end, there is consensus, which would mean this thing could still function as a blockchain if you did what Nakamoto said and waited until the block got deep enough. It would have to get beyond the branches and into the trunk. Then you could trust that. So if this is true, it means that any block tree with a positive rate of communication remains in consensus within a bounded distance of its maximum height at all times. Now, there's two things we don't know about this. We don't know the speed, and we don't know the shape. So they're two open questions. We've got reason to believe it's true. One is simulations. It's pretty hard to do this because the input of one set of DEs is the output of the previous one, so it gets unstable, but we've iterated about 50 times. If you look at it, the shape sort of changes, but you can believe that as it's going along here, it's sort of stabilized to a particular shape. And the speed looks pretty constant, right? You know, the distance between those things. So that's one reason to believe it. Simulation supports it. The second reason is that if you go back to these equations and you do what, math physicists would do, is approximate the spatial difference by a derivative. In fact, you have to approximate it with the second derivative. You get what's called the Fisher-KPP equation, named after Fisher, and the KPP is Kolmogorov plus a couple of his colleagues, so some real greats have thought about this. There was a whole bunch of talks at the end of conference last week about Fisher-KPP equations. That's a PDE that has traveling wave solutions. And this is not a PDE, it's a system of differential, it's an infinite system of differential equations, but it's probably similar. So we think it has. The actual speed of the Fisher KPP equation is 2, whatever the parameters are. We're not sure how that's useful. So it's not helping with that question with the speed. And that's all I've got. Thanks for listening, everyone.